candidate. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the first ever Presidential Candidate Forum on Entrepreneurship. We are next pleased to welcome Mr. Larry Elder. Larry Elder is best known as a talk show host of The Larry Elder Show for many years. In fact, when I lived in Los Angeles many years ago, more years than I'm afraid to admit, I used to listen to a show all the time. It began as a local show in the LA station KABC, then became nationally syndicated, first by the ABC radio networks and later by the Salem Media Group. He's an entrepreneur himself. He trained as a lawyer and in 1980 founded a law-related executive search firm, Laurence A. Elder and Associates, which he owned for 15 years. He's an author, and he's been a nationally syndicated columnist to the Creator Syndicate. He's a graduate of Brown University and the University of Michigan Law School. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Larry Elder.
Victor, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Elder.
Christine, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
God bless.
Well, thank you for coming here, Mr. Elder, to visit us on the campaign trail in Cedar Rapids. You've been an entrepreneur. You've known many entrepreneurs throughout your entire life. What have you seen as the things that have gotten in the way of entrepreneurs in the course of starting and growing businesses? And how would you, as president, approach trying to help them break down those barriers?
Well, you're talking to somebody who's from the state of California. There's a magazine called CEO Magazine, Victor. Been around about 15 years. For 15 years, they've asked CEOs of large, medium, and small companies, what's the best state in which to do business? What's the worst? For 15 consecutive years, California has been determined to be the worst. Our tax structure, 13.3% state income tax, the highest in the nation. The regulations, our budget. When I was running for governor, I got briefed on the budget. After about an hour and a half, I said, this isn't the budget, this is a crime scene. The unfunded pension liability, 1.5 trillion, T as in Tyrannosaurus. The budget has turned from a $100 billion surplus that Gavin Newsom bragged about to a $30 billion government deficit. For the first time in 170 years, people are leaving California, and the primary reason they cite, Victor, is they can't afford the price of a home. The average price of a home in California is 175% above the national average, and the reason for that is the collusion between the Democrats that are supermajorities in both the Senate and the Assembly, and the environmentalists who hate any kind of development, no matter what it is. And as a result, there are about 1 million fewer houses that otherwise would be the case in California. And as a result, supply and demand is not rocket science. The price of homes has gone up. What I was privileged to see, however, when I ran for governor, is I met a bunch of people, a bunch of prospective donors and donors, many of whom are business people, and somehow, some way, they still manage to make money despite the regulatory labyrinth that they have to navigate through. Our country is overtaxed, it's overregulated, and one of the many things I'm going to do when I become president, in the unlikely event that somebody else becomes president, I'll be urging this, is an amendment to the Constitution to fix spending to a set percentage of the GDP, with exceptions for war and for natural disaster. And the reason for this is that much of the budget is on automatic pilot. By that, I'm talking about the so-called entitlements. I say so-called because, frankly, I think calling Social Security and Medicare that we pay into it an entitlement is a little unfair, but that's what they're called. And they are on automatic pilot. Under Ronald Reagan, my favorite president, government got bigger. When he ran, he promised to shut down the Department of Education. When he left, it was bigger than before. Government was bigger. It got bigger under George Herbert Walker Bush. It got bigger under George W. Bush. It got bigger under Donald Trump. And the reason, as I said, is because of the entitlements programs. I'll use the word unsustainable to describe them. I use that word because it was used by both Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. But woe to any politician that runs promising to reform them, because you will lose elections. The other side will accuse you of not caring about the poor, the sick, the elderly. That's why the can gets kicked down the road all the time. These programs are not going to be there for young people unless they are reformed. The only way to have that is for you to make the politicians immune from having to go to voters and having to deal with the wrath of voters. The number one agenda of most politicians is to get elected. Number two is to get reelected. An amendment to fix spending would require them to fix spending to a certain percentage, as I said earlier, and then they can say to the voters, the devil made me do it, please don't hurt me in the ballot box. And it may sound like pie in the sky, but the Constitution has been amended on average once every 10 years. And if the president were to forcefully, persuasively make the case, particularly to young voters, why we need to do this, I believe it can happen. But that's the only way to rein in spending and to do something about the debt and deficit.
Now, I want to go to one point you talked about, which is the unfavorable climate in California for entrepreneurship. Yet, so much of the world and looks to California, there have been a lot of notable entrepreneurial successes.
Right.
How have entrepreneurs been able to do it despite that, and what lessons can be learned about how to help entrepreneurship grow in places like that?
Well, people who are entrepreneurs are clever, they're creative, they're innovative, they figure out ways. However, as I said, people are leaving, and they're taking their tax dollars with them. For example, if you are a large fast food restaurant owner in California, the governor has just signed a bill to set up a commission to determine the wages of your fast food employees. Think about that. An independent third party is going to determine your wages, and the suggested minimum is $22.50. Right now, they're being paid $12.50. So you're having a body of bureaucrats determine what your wages are. This is why there's been a war on business people in California. They treat business people like villains. They treat villains like they're victims of society. It's outrageous. There was just a bill that was overturned by the courts. They found it a violation of the 14th Amendment. If you are a publicly held corporation in California, depending upon the size, you're required to have at least one female member of your board of directors. What? I kind of thought MLK was all about content of character rather than color of skin or gender. That was overturned. However, that did not stop Governor Gavin Newsom signing another bill that requires every publicly held corporation, depending upon the size, to have at least one member of the LGBTQ+ community on its board of directors. Are you nuts? Are you insane? That's what's going on in California. And as I said, it's a full-throated war. The idea is that business people can be squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, and somehow they'll still remain. Well, Elon Musk left and took his $1 billion with him. I believe, I can't really quite remember the amount of money, but there would have been billions of dollars in taxes every single year that California would have generated just from him alone. They're no longer going to get. Dave Rubin has left. A number of other major entrepreneurs have left California, and sooner or later, it's uncle. I remember watching the Bill Maher show. There was some new tax bill that just got passed, and Bill Maher started complaining. And when Bill Maher starts complaining about taxes being too high, maybe they're too high.
When you were an entrepreneur, one of the businesses you've run over the years.
But I ran mine in Ohio, though, Victor.
You're in Ohio, okay, but still,
different.
all right, in Ohio too.
A little different, yeah.
But what did you find to be the things that stood in the way of your success?
Well, it's interesting. When I ran a headhunting firm, I'm a lawyer, and I worked for a large law firm for a few years. I got a whole bunch of phone calls from headhunters. And I was struck by the fact that virtually none of them was a lawyer. They'd call you about an opportunity somewhere else, and I would say, well, what kind of law are they looking for? And they would go, well, a lawyer. I said, well, what kind of law? Well, a lawyer. And it occurred to me they didn't know what they were talking about. So I read an article in a magazine called American Lawyer called Headhunters Dialing for Dollars. And I remember reading it and saying, these guys are making money, and they're not even lawyers. They have no clue about what lawyers do, what the language is. So I decided to do that. And I started a headhunting firm. And shortly after I started it, the legislatures passed a law that put on a sales tax for services, law, medicine, and also my business. The lawyers hired a lobbyist to go down to Columbus to exempt them from the bill, and they were successful. The doctors hired a lobbyist to exempt them from the bill. They were successful. We, meaning headhunters and personnel agencies, collectively put in our nickels and dimes to hire one. We were unsuccessful. So it put a 5% sales tax on every transaction, and as a result, I got fewer transactions. They made less money than they would have made had they left us alone. I've seen that happen over and over and over again. In LA, they just passed something called the mansion tax. If you have a residence or a commercial business above a certain level, you're going to pay a 4 or 5% tax above a certain level. The idea was to raise money for the homeless. It's been in business for now about a year, and they raised far less money than they thought they were going to raise. This happens over and over and over again. Business people are not stupid. They either didn't sell their house when they thought they were going to sell it, or they're going to wait, or they're going to figure out some sort of way of getting around the tax.
Building on Victor's question about being an entrepreneur, what are 3 things that you learned from running a business and really knowing what it's like in the trenches that you would then apply to being president of the United States?
3 things?
Yes.
Well, the first thing is, somebody once said, running a business is an exercise in terror and disorder. Running a business, for anybody who runs one, it is difficult. If you work 9 to 5, there's a word for that, it's called bankrupt. People put their heart and soul in businesses in order for them to be successful. My father left home at the age of 13 years old. His irresponsible mother threw him out of the house. Athens, Georgia, Jim Crow South, black boy at the beginning of the Great Depression. He picked up trash. He became a Pullman porter in the trains, a long way of answering your question. Became a Pullman porter in the trains. And came to this place called California, a city called Los Angeles, Christine. And my dad was blown away. You could walk through the front door of a restaurant and get served. And so my dad made a mental note, maybe someday I'll relocate to California. Pearl Harbor, my dad joins the Marines. He ends up in Guam, where there was very heavy fighting, became a staff sergeant in charge of cooking for the colored soldiers. Gets out, goes back to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he met and married my mom to get him a job as a short order cook. Goes to restaurant after restaurant, pardon the language, and he's told, we don't hire niggers. My dad went to an unemployment office. Lady said, you went through the wrong door. My dad goes out to the hall and sees colored only, goes to that door to the very same lady who sent him out. Came home to my mom and said, this is nonsense, I'm going to LA where I was before the war, I'm gonna get me a job as a cook. Walks around and they tell him, you don't have any references. My dad said, I need references to make ham and eggs? Goes to the unemployment office, this time just one door, and the lady calls him up, she says, I don't have anything. My dad said, what time do you open? She says, 9, what time do you close? She says, 5. My dad said, I'll be sitting in that chair till you find something. My dad sat there for a whole day, came back the next day. She calls him up around lunchtime. I have something, I don't know whether you're going to want it. My dad said, of course I'm going to want it. I'm starting a family, what is it? She said, it's a job cleaning toilets at Nabisco brand bread. My dad did that for over 10 years, full-time, took a second full-time job cleaning toilets at another bread company, cooked for a family on the weekend because he wanted my mom to be a stay-at-home mom, which she was until the youngest of us was in middle school. And my dad went to night school to get his GED, and then when he got his GED, he went to night school to learn how to operate a small restaurant. The man never slept. Age of 47, puts his nickels and dimes together from these jobs, starts a little cafe, which he ran until his 80s. When my dad retired, he owned that building, the land, little property next door, plus the house that's still in our family. And talk about somebody who worked. And he got up at around 4 o'clock. The restaurant opened at 6:30, not 6:31, not 6:29, 6:30. He closed it at 2:30, and he worked his tail off. When my dad retired, we sold the business, but I'm the one who negotiated the deal, and I put a clause in it that we get it back because the person he sold it to was going to operate it as a restaurant. I said, Dad, there's no way this man's going to be able to operate this restaurant successfully. He goes, why? I said, Dad, look what you put into it. Look what your heart and my dad baked cakes. He baked cherry cakes. He baked German chocolate cakes. He baked pies, coconut, walnut pies, sweet potato pies. I mean, my dad had this massive, massive menu for this little diner, 15 seats. My dad was an artist. He loved cooking. And so we put a clause, we get the restaurant back. I said, Dad, this restaurant won't last 6 months. It lasted 3 months. We got it back because this guy didn't put in the heart and soul into running the restaurant. So my long way of saying, one of the things I've always learned about people that run businesses is it takes a lot of work, a lot of effort.
So how would you support them if you're elected president?
Takes the burden off of them. Less regulation, less taxes. My dad would complain all the time about this bill, this fee. He didn't even understand why they had so many fees. Minimum wage. I know people believe who don't know anything about Economics 101 that if an employer didn't have to pay a minimum wage, he or she wouldn't pay anything. False. It's hard to find good people. That's the number one difficulty anybody has at running a business. Finding good people, training them, and retaining them. And good people are worth every bit of it. You don't need to tell an employer how much to pay a good person. That employer will do so. However, at one point in our nation's history, a black teenager was more likely to be employed than a white teenager, or a black male or a white male, because the teenager was able to sell his wares for the fair market value. Income to minimum wage, which was passed in 1935, and it was jacked up and jacked up and jacked up. And once it got to a certain level above inflation, all of a sudden, teenagers looking for jobs in the inner city, black teenagers, were unemployed. Milton Friedman, my favorite economist, who wrote Free to Choose, he said that the minimum wage law is, quote, perhaps the most anti-Negro law in the statute books, close quote. So laws like that. George McGovern, who was the Democrat standard bearer in 1972, I think he's probably the most left-wing guy up there. Decent guy, but left-wing. He retires, and he went on the college lecture circuit and made a lot of money speaking. And when he got off the lecture circuit, he fulfilled his lifelong dream was to run a bed and breakfast in Connecticut. And he did. Hired the best people to negotiate the deal, and the bed and breakfast went bust. And a chagrined George McGovern wrote a piece that was published in the Wall Street Journal all about what he wished he had known when he was a lawmaker, now that he's run a business. And what he learned is that the businesses are all overregulated, overtaxed, and had I known that, I would have been a better legislator. Well, duh.
So if you were elected president, if I'm an entrepreneur, things that I could watch for would be less regulation, less tax.
Less taxes.
Those would be the kind of the two pillars.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
We're overtaxed. I was on Fox and Friends one morning. When I'm on Fox and Friends, I get fact-checked all the time. And I pointed out that in 1900, at all three levels, Christine, government took less than 10% from the American people. All three levels. Right now, government takes around 32%, I said. So I get a phone call from one of these left-wing fact-check organizations. I watched you this morning on Fox. You said in 1900, government at all three levels took less than 10% from the American people. Do you have a source for that? I said, oh no, I just pulled it out of my you-know-what. Of course I have a source. I gave him a source. Do you have a source for your assertion right now the government takes around 32% from the American people? I gave him a source. To their credit, they said I was right. My point is they were gobsmacked by that. These were young people who had no idea how much bigger government is. I'm an Article 1, Section 8 guy. And the Founding Fathers in Article 1, Section 8 outlined the handful of duties and responsibilities to be done by the federal government. And FEMA, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, however you feel about those programs, were not part of it. Indeed, to finance them required the Constitution be amended for the income tax. President James Monroe was our 5th president. His sole veto that he cast was a bill that he vetoed that would have expanded the Cumberland Road, even though it would have gone through Virginia, which was its home state, and would have benefited his Virginians financially. He said, where in this document, referring to the Constitution, does it give me the power to extract taxes from other states for a project in my state? Now, nobody would even think about that. We all call it infrastructure spending, or if we don't like it, we call it pork. If you do like it, we call it investments. Either way, it's completely inconsistent with the vision the Founding Fathers had. And so if I could rule the world and get the government down to the size it ought to get down to, it would be probably 80% smaller than what it is.
And just
I think I probably have just lost California and New York when I'm in my presidential campaign.
Well, specifically for this audience who we're trying to really serve, what would that mean for SBA? What would that mean for divisions of commerce that that really rely on, that really benefit and nurture small to mid-sized businesses?
I'm not quite sure that SBA does that. I think SBA has a much high failure rate of loans than banks do, and the taxpayers pick up that. Look, most businesses are started by your mother, your father, your uncle giving you money. We were just talking a little while ago about Berry Gordy Jr. Berry Gordy Jr. is the guy that founded Motown. He was an auto worker who borrowed $300 or $400 from his mother or father, I forget which one, and Motown became Motown. Well, fast forward, I saw Berry Gordy Jr. at a party once, and someone introduced him to me as a Republican. I'm a Republican. And Berry Gordy Jr. said, you know, I hear you're a Republican. I would rather vote for a Klansman than vote for a Republican. He walked away. Several years later, he sold Motown, and because of California's capital gains taxes, he had a huge, huge tax bite. So I saw him at a party a few years later. I mentioned that to him, and I said, you know, Barry, when I first met you a few years ago, you told me that you'd rather vote for the Klan than vote for a Republican. How do you feel now? And he said, and I quote, well, my thinking has evolved, close quote.
I want to go to a question from the audience. One of the questions, and you've been talking a lot about the role of government and the private sector, which is around subsidies. And if you look at the way that a lot of policy is structured, the government actually subsidizes a lot of big corporations.
Right.
Economic development, for instance, for attracting companies across borders, anywhere from $30 to $50 billion. Our workforce training system is about $13 to $20 billion, which is almost all around workforce training for large corporations. Should that be more even? Should we be subsidizing entrepreneurs in the same way, or what do you think of that?
Again, if I could rule the world, we wouldn't be doing that at all. Most businesses train their own people. It's in your best interest to make sure you've got good people and you train them. I don't think government should be picking winners and losers, and that's what government does. We've seen that regarding places like Solyndra and other entrepreneurs, other businesses that government decides they're going to back. For example, this whole EV industry. I think the technology behind EVs is really pretty impressive. I drove one for the first time the other day, and I couldn't believe the acceleration. But I don't believe we ought to be bribing people to buy them. If there's a market for them, they ought to be able to make a car and put it at a price point where people can buy it. We shouldn't be subsidizing them. So I'm not in favor of any of these kinds of things. I know we do them. I know both parties do them. To me, picking winners and losers is not something government should be doing.
Well, given that it's happening anyways, right? And it's happening not just the federal level, but the state and local level as well. How do you level the playing field, right? So, because entrepreneurs now, it's harder to get healthcare, it's harder to get home loans, it's harder to get car loans, it's harder to get so many of the things that for a big company are fairly easy to do.
Well, again, life isn't fair. Starting a business is difficult. I don't believe that it's government's job to, quote, level the playing field by taking taxpayers or by picking winners and losers or by imposing regulations on this business or that business or this business. I think that makes things worse. You know, we have a GDP growth in the last 20 years of maybe 3%, a little bit above that. At one time, our GDP growth was much higher than that. And that's when government was much smaller. The more money you take from the American people, the more inefficiently that money will be spent. Milton Friedman said there are 4 ways of spending money, from most efficient to least efficient. The most efficient is when you spend your money on yourself. Second most is when you spend your money on somebody you care about. Third is when somebody spends his money on you. It's when you have an expense account. You can't go crazy, otherwise you get fired. The least efficient, most inefficient way of spending money is somebody else's money on somebody else. And that's what a lot of our money being spent is, somebody else's money on somebody else. And it's making things worse. It's causing economic growth to slow down. And as a result, people are hurt. And the people at the bottom are hurt the most. Jack Kennedy said, a rising tide lifts all boats. Nobody called that trickle down. He lowered the top rate from, he proposed anyway, it went into effect after he got killed, from 90% to 70%. Ronald Reagan cut it from 70% to 28%. In both cases, government businesses grew, they flourished. You take less money from the American people and things are going to be better. And for some reason, Democrats don't feel that way at all. I remember when Barack Obama was running for president, Charlie Gibson of ABC News said, Senator, you want to raise capital gains. Historically, when you raise capital gains, the government has generated less revenue from the capital gains increase. And Obama said, well, that may happen, that may not happen. And he raised the capital gains. And he did not generate the kinds of money that he assumed was going to happen. That happens over and over and over again. People aren't stupid. They've had wealth tax in countries in Europe, and almost every single country that imposed it has now withdrawn it because they find out that people who are very wealthy are not stupid. They figure out ways of either moving their businesses elsewhere or somehow figuring out some sort of way of hiding it. So the less burden you have on people, the better. I was watching a debate one time between the chair of the RNC, Reince Priebus, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the chair of the DNC at the time. And they were talking on television, and I am very active on Twitter, and Reince Priebus follows me. It was a live show, so I tweeted something hoping that he would see it. He didn't. And Debbie Wasserman Schultz said, I want a party that has my back. So I tweeted to Reince Priebus, please respond, I want a party that gets government off my back. Well, he didn't get it, and so he didn't say it, but that's how I see it.
We, prior to this debate, this forum, we reached out to many of the Inc. 5000 businesses across America to kind of get their feedback. Building on your discussion of leveling the playing field, one question that came up from female entrepreneurs, an area that that is trying to grow, is that there's just fewer opportunities for funding right now. 1.9% of all VC funding in 2022 went to female entrepreneurs. What efforts could be made if you were elected president to level the playing field for more diversity of access to capital?
You keep saying things like level the playing field. I think I've addressed that. I don't think it's the government's...
Actually, yeah, I just am building on what you had said.
I don't think it's government's job to level the playing field. Look, there are more women now in college than men. There are as many women now being admitted to law school and medical school as men. They are less likely to commit crime. They live longer. Instead of suggesting that somehow we should be doing something for women, we should be talking about the fact that if you work hard, invest in yourself, you'll be just fine.
Just building on that, though, I mean, I know a lot of women who work hard and invest in themselves, but they're brilliant entrepreneurs, but they're not getting access to capital like men are. And I'm just wondering what we can do to shift that.
I don't know that I agree with that. I'd like to see your source for that assertion. I know, for example, the reason we had the big recession 2007, 2008, Christine, is because of this assertion that credit-worthy black would-be borrowers were not getting mortgages. Federal Home Loan did a big study, and it turned out that black borrowers, would-be borrowers for mortgages were being turned out at a higher rate than white people were.
I'm sorry, you're saying that was the source of the 2007, 2008
Yeah, well,
recession?
that was a pressure put on the lending community to change standards. At one time, you had to have 5 years worth of solid work experience. You had to be deemed be credit worthy, that was all changed because, in my opinion, the government put pressure on lenders through carrot and through stick. By carrot, I'm talking about buying the loans by government, by Fannie and Freddie, and stick. If you don't lend to credit to diversified would-be borrowers, we're going to hold up your mergers. We're going to hold up your putting in ATMs. And so the whole lending standards in our entire industry was changed largely because of the assumption that black would-be borrowers were not getting loans. Let me just finish.
Actually, no, I covered the real estate finance market for the Wall Street Journal at the time, and it was also not just residential, but it was commercial loans. It was the issue of CMBS and CDOs. So I think that the actual narrative was much broader than that.
There's something called the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, and the Democrats all argued the reason for the meltdown was because we needed to have more lending standards, more regulations, and the minorities, the Republicans, all said what I said, that the reason for this was pressure put on the lending community to change the standards so that more people of color would get homes. My point is this. Barack Obama, he was in private practice for a while, and he joined a bunch of other lawyers on behalf of 186 black people that applied for loans from Citigroup who didn't get the loans. And they claimed that in a class action lawsuit, Citigroup was refusing to give them loans because they were not credit worthy. So Citigroup said, okay, hell with it, here are your loans. Fast forward, virtually every single one of the 186 lost his or her home. Many of them filed for bankruptcy. Surprise, surprise, it turned out the reason they were not getting the loans is that they were not credit worthy. Secondly, Asian borrowers, would-be borrowers, were being accepted at a higher rate than white applicants were. So it just turns out that banks have, it's in their best interest to lend money to people who can pay it back. And the idea that somehow government should come in here and because we have disparities, the disparities somehow mean racism or sexism, I just would like to see the data.
I'd actually like to pivot back because now you are a founder of a bank, and this is something that would also be really useful to our audience. You're extending loans to businesses, and if you could just tell us more about that, I think that's just really useful content.
Sure, it's called Old Glory Bank, and I co-founded it along with people that are experienced bankers, and Dr. Ben Carson and John Rich, country western singer, and the idea is that there are a lot of banks that are being pressured into canceling accounts because their depositors are buyers of guns or that they belong to the NRA. There was a concert, a forum that Donald Trump Jr. wanted to put on, I think it was in Missouri, and PayPal refused to process the ticket processes because they didn't like the message. So Old Glory Bank has something called Old Glory PayPal, so that won't happen. Old Glory Pay. It's a full-service online bank. It has a physical structure in Oklahoma for personal, for business, for home loans, for equity loans, for the whole 9 yards.
So if I'm a small business owner, I'm an entrepreneur, and I've just really been hit hard by the Silicon Valley Bank fallout in the last few months, is your bank a place that I can go to for lending?
You can try. I don't know what their reaction will be, but you can certainly try.
Okay.
Yeah.
To this point around capital access, one of the things in the banking sector has been, we've heard bankers say they're really restricted in their ability to fund a lot of the entrepreneurs. And a lot of entrepreneurs now, especially those starting out, they don't have a lot of assets, so it's hard for banks to get collateral. They don't have years of financial statements, so it's hard for banks to look backwards. How can we make banking more accessible and capital more accessible for entrepreneurs?
Victor, banks aren't angels. Banks are not supposed to be starting startups. That's not what they do. Banks lend to businesses that already have a track record. Again, that's what angels are for. The term angel meaning somebody who's willing to invest in your company. The idea is that they expect to get a high rate of return, and that's what moms and dads are for, and also nonprofits. The more money there is, the more money people give to nonprofits. So again, making business people more successful, more profitable means they have more disposable income. They can give more money to nonprofits that invest in businesses like this. But again, it's not government's job.
And so looking to things like nonprofit lenders and those types of opportunities are the way to go for.
Absolutely, yeah.
And do you believe that that's something that how do you encourage more of that, I guess? How do you encourage more accessible capital?
The more money you have, the more disposable income you have, the more generous you can be with your money. Under Ronald Reagan, I noticed that the amount of money that people gave for nonprofits, for churches, for organizations went up dramatically. It's surprising. The more money people have, the more generous they are. You know, you can do a few things with your money. You can invest it, you can give it away, you can spend it. But the more money you have, the better off you are, the more money there is for all sorts of things, including for giving money to entrepreneurs.
Before we finish, one thing I promised to bring up that is also part of another business, a separate business enterprise, but you have a book coming out in September.
I do. It's called As Goes California, My Mission to Rescue the Golden State and Save the Nation. My goals are modest. In the book, I talk about what our one-party state Democrats have done to California to discourage business people. As I mentioned, people are leaving California for the first time in 170 years. You name the job-killing bill, the Democrats have passed it, and Republicans need not even show up for work. And so it's kind of an object lesson as to what can happen to the rest of the nation if the experiment known as California infects everything else.
Mr. Elder, thank you so much for being with us today to talk about entrepreneurship and the
pleasure.
American dream. And
thank you.
We appreciate your time.
The American dream is alive and well. Just got to go for it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank
Christine.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you. And we've got a special guest before we take a break. I am pleased to welcome the mayor of Cedar Rapids, Tiffany O'Donnell. So as I mentioned earlier, we chose Cedar Rapids in particular because of the role that entrepreneurs have played in the rebirth and revitalization of this town post the 2008 flood. Mayor O'Donnell has really been part of that effort in advancing entrepreneurship as part of the rebuild of this town. In running for office, she said that Cedar Rapids, quote, needs to lean into our entrepreneurial ecosystem. It's what makes Cedar Rapids unique. She's also the CEO of Women Lead Change, which is now 5 offices across Iowa and South Dakota. Join me for a conversation with Mayor O'Donnell.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So tell me about what makes Cedar Rapids so special.
Oh, thank you for asking. You know, I really mean that when I say lean into our entrepreneurial ecosystem. It's rich. 175 years, actually, Cedar Rapids has been around, founded by innovators, dreamers, and doers. It is truly a part of our DNA in Cedar Rapids. I think when you travel across our state, it may be a relatively small state of 3 million, but culturally diverse. And when you talk about Cedar Rapids, it is synonymous with dreamers and doers. You only have to look as far as, you know, putting a man on the moon. And that was thanks to a gentleman named Arthur Collins, who happened to invent the radio that was used as we put a man on the moon. That antenna proudly still stands in Cedar Rapids. You can't travel without seeing a truck that says CRST on it. That is based here in Cedar Rapids. You go to a convenience store and you're going to see little drug packets that say little drugstore products. Well, that's now just one segment of a billion-dollar organization that was started by a Cedar Rapidian who found an ad in the back of the Wall Street Journal about this concept. It is in our DNA to create here, and I can't say enough about the community at Coe, the leadership at Coe that has really chosen to lean into that, and right to start for choosing to come to Cedar Rapids to talk about this really important issue, certainly to Cedar Rapids.
So tell me, what can Cedar Rapidians teach the rest of America? I think this is a time when, if you read sort of the national narrative, it's like dysfunction, we're at war with each other, we're falling apart, but then you come to a place like the heartland of America, and you find people working to build stuff. And I spent many years in Kansas City. I'm a child of the heartland, and to me, there's a disconnect between what you see on the ground here and what you read about in kind of the national narrative.
Absolutely, and thank you for saying that. You know, you mentioned the floods of '08. That is potentially the most illustrative example of who we are as a community and as a culture. We're very independent. We like to do things ourselves. Our entrepreneurial community did lift us up at that time. It is really, when I say it's a part of our DNA, it's a part of our paradigm to build and create, and that independence. When your grandfather and your great-grandfather and your great-great-great-grandfather built something, that's just what you do. And I think for entrepreneurs looking for holistic support. And it is not just the capital, which we have some tremendous programs for entrepreneurs. It is also the issues around entrepreneurship. You know, building a family while you're doing this. Specifically in my work at Women Lead Change, we know the unique challenges that women can find in getting capital and in raising their families the way they want to while they're building. Cedar Rapids is a place where we see all of that. We recognize all of that. It's just a part of who we are, and we do our best to make sure that we have all of those systems in place to support entrepreneurs, no matter where they are.
Do you have any favorite entrepreneurial stories in Cedar Rapids? When you walk around sort of the heart of Cedar Rapids, you see all these stores everywhere. It's just there's an entrepreneurial energy. Do you have any favorite stories out of all that?
Well, honestly, I touched on little drugstore products. You know, there's a gentleman named Denny Oldorf who literally, he was a banker, and he happened to see in the want ads in the back of the Wall Street Journal this concept for these little packets of drugs, and he bought the rights to this concept, and he and his wife would staple pills together at their dining room table. Well, fast forward to that, we're now into just the second generation of this company, still in the family, and now this is a company that not only does that, but is the owner of many products globally. They've purchased the rights to products globally. Ideas here are treasured. We say welcome is our language in Cedar Rapids. If you land at the Cedar Rapids Airport, you'll hear that, and it means the obvious. We really want to welcome all of our visitors to Cedar Rapids, but on a much broader level, welcome is also a welcome of ideas and innovation and an openness. Because again, it is a part of our paradigm. It is not unique for somebody to be here because they want to start something.
And finally, there's been some debate about why Iowa is the first state, right, in the nominating cycle, and what is special about a place like this that makes it a voice that actually makes sense to have as a first state in the cycle?
You know, I mentioned our independence. I truly believe we have our own minds. We are also a very pragmatic people. At the end of the day, this is an agricultural state, so when the state picks someone like Barack Obama, people made a big deal about it at the time, but actually here in Iowa, we just sort of, we want the best person for the job. That's kind of what we just want to get. We want to get stuff done here. We also, ingrained in us, is everybody puts their pants on one leg at a time. So you come to Cedar Rapids, and it's not unusual for us to meet what others may call important or special people out there. We actually have come to take that job very seriously. So I think any candidate that wants to know what people are talking about and how we really feel, unfiltered, finds Iowa a really rich place.
Well, Mayor O'Donnell, thank you for having us here in Cedar Rapids today. Thanks for sharing your love of this town, and we're just grateful to be here. Thank you for
Grateful for having you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And now we will take another 7-minute break as we take time for media, and you can take a networking break yourselves, and we'll be right back. Thank you all.